we have here? Driver Ed, upgrade from the old Honda Civic. What am I sitting in? More on that later. But welcome back to another edition of converting my actual book into an audio book. And for this particular segment, I'm not going to lie, it's going to be a bit of a letdown in the sense that it's not like a great Uber story, but I had 4 chapters that were all based on Uber pool experiences. And in order to understand those chapters, it was necessary to understand what an Uber pool was. For anyone that was an Uber driver, you can attest to the fact that a lot of the people that use the Uber pool service didn't even understand what an Uber pool was. When they would get in your car and you'd have to say, oh, we got another rider added to the trip. And they'd be like, what do you mean? What do you mean? This trip was 50% cheaper for a reason? For anybody following along to the book, I mean, it is pretty important to understand how Uber Pool works in order to get these other chapters. And, you know, maybe a driver will appreciate the explanation. I'm curious to see if you guys agree on my assessment on how Uber really dropped the ball with explaining this and rolling this service out the way they did. But I'd be curious for any drivers out there to drop in the comments the worst or craziest or most absurd experience you guys had with an Uber pool ride. Because as you know, Uber is crazy enough as is, so when you're combining multiple strangers who are not only strangers to the driver, but strangers to each other, it just, you know, it's like gasoline on a fire. So anyway, let me know in the comments your particular Uber pool instances that made you realize that Uber pool is an absolute nightmare. And yeah, I'm not even leaving this open for discussion. It's not like, oh, some drivers think it's okay and other drivers don't. No, it is a 99.9%. There's always that one little sliver of uncertainty that you can't be sure that maybe somewhere out there just doesn't even realize that it doesn't have to be this way. But 99.9% of drivers will agree that this was an absolute, is, and probably forever will be an absolute nightmare of a service. And I say is because they did reintroduce it into some markets. I think I've seen it in the Philly market, but I never accept those rides. So yeah, let me know in the comments what you think. And now as far as the whip, I am actually in the middle of a project I'm really excited about. I rented an Uber I rented a Tesla through Hertz, through Uber. It's a program that I see marketed a whole lot. And I've actually had 2 drivers that were like really selling me on it. And I'm listening to them talk. And in my head, I'm like, this just makes absolutely no sense at all. But I want to have an open mind and I want to go into this project trying to see if it works or not. I mean, I think we all know Uber has a problem. That problem being it absolutely destroys people's cars and they're not paying a high enough wage for it to make sense for drivers. So if this rental program can be an answer to that, that would be great. But I have my doubts, but I'm an objective Temple trained journalist that's going to get to the bottom of the story, not through hearsay, but doing it myself. So make sure you click subscribe. I'm going to work all weekend with this rental and I'm hoping to have that video up as soon as possible, hopefully next weekend. All right, thanks for watching, guys.
Chapter 17, The Explanation of Uber Pool. For chapters 18 through 21, you have to understand how Uber service, formerly known as Pool and since rebranded to Uber Share, functions. Lyft has a similar feature called Share as well. Here's how they work. In its never-ending hunt to squeeze every penny out of the transportation industry while simultaneously maintaining its loose relationship with the truth, Uber created a cheaper alternative known as Uber Pool. A great idea in theory, it was most certainly made by somebody who has never worked as an Uber driver and has enough money that they would never actually use the service. In other words, it's poor people shit. The idea behind Uber Pool, for those unfamiliar, is that you can carpool with people going the same direction as you for a cheaper price. Say Jack calls an Uber Pool to the airport 40 minutes away. On the way there, they pick up John, also going to the airport. Ideally, the riders get the same service for cheaper, and the driver gets paid more because he has 2 fares in his car. In theory, it's a dream solution that saved riders money and helped drivers earn more. In reality, it was a nightmare for everyone. The problem started with the fact that it was presented to the rider as a cheaper alternative without being clear as to why. I can't tell you how many times Uber pool riders who were already in my car were confused, surprised, or even angry that we had to stop and pick someone else up. On one hand, I understand that it was a newer service and Uber seemed to intentionally make it unclear as to what exactly would happen when they ordered an Uber pool, leaving it to the driver to break the bad news. On the other hand, I sometimes wanted to scream at these passengers, especially when they were taking their anger out on me for a choice that they made. It's like, I'm sorry, sir, but why did you think this option was 50% cheaper? Are you God's gift to earth and you're being rewarded for it in the form of a cheap Uber? Didn't you think maybe there was a catch? After people get past the fact that they are not God's gift and they'll be riding with a stranger, they then have to experience one of the most frustrating parts of driving for Uber: the waiting. Some riders might take the full 5 minutes to come out to the car, which means if you're a passenger in an Uber pool, that's 5 minutes sitting in the car with your Uber driver waiting for a stranger. Even if you don't have somewhere to be, the awkwardness of that situation can make that 5 minutes feel like forever. And that could happen multiple times in a single trip. And to make matters worse, the way the algorithm worked was that if, as a rider, your destination was the furthest away out of everyone else in the Uber pool, and the pool kept getting riders added to it, you could be in the car essentially forever. For example, if you are going to the airport on the edge of town, but on the way, Uber kept adding riders to the pool that were en route to the airport, but never actually at the airport, as a driver, I'd be required to pick those people up, and this would go on as long as the app kept adding riders, as drivers didn't even have the option to reject an added rider once an Uber pool trip started. As such, I always thought a more appropriate name for Uber pool would have been Uber orgy, because once it starts, nobody has any idea who is riding where and how long it's going to take. But by the time it's done, everybody is going to feel like they got fucked. Speaking from personal experience as a rider, I once opted to save $15 at the end of a night and went with Uber Pool, which should have been a 5-minute trip, turned into a 45-minute trip as the minivan we were in kept picking up more and more people. And as a driver, I've seen quite a few riders miss their flights due to opting for an Uber Pool. What happens is they're presented with an estimated time of arrival to their destination when they order it, but then during the ride, the ETA is pushed back because of additional pickups. I remember one time, after informing a lone female passenger heading to the airport that we were going to have to take a detour and pick someone else up, she asked me to let her out on the highway in a last-ditch effort to call another Uber and catch her flight. I hinted at the idea that if she were to offer me the right amount of cash, I'd sign off the app and just take her directly to the airport. But I wasn't pushy about it, as it always feels a bit uncomfortable telling a rider that we should operate off the app, especially when that rider is a woman by herself. Regardless, I don't know if she was uncomfortable with the idea or was just too innocent to realize that for the right price, anyone will do just about anything. But either way, she didn't bite. Now, I couldn't bring myself to leave her on the highway as she requested, and I pulled off at the next exit to at least give her next driver a chance of finding her. I always wondered if she made it. And as if it wasn't frustrating enough from the driver's end, dealing with all of the added nonsense of picking up extra riders, being rerouted constantly, and having to explain to disgruntled passengers why someone else is getting in, I'm sorry, sir. I know you didn't realize you'd be sharing the ride, but that's the reason it was so much cheaper. As if it couldn't get worse, the real kicker was that earnings from Uber pool fares were considerably lower than a regular Uber. Plus, the kind of people who typically order Uber pool are not in a spot financially where they will be willing to tip. So your bottom line really takes a dive. When the pandemic hit, Uber was forced to shut the service down, and not until recently has it been brought back, and only in certain markets. In summation, Uber Pool was an absolute shit show, but it did make for spectacular content. The following 4 chapters are stories that took place as a result of an Uber pool ride.
Let me know what you thought of the explanation. I hope it was sufficient in your eyes if you were a fellow driver. And if you did not know what Uber Pool was, I hope you get a better understanding of it now. But most importantly, let me know in the comments, fellow drivers, the worst, most crazy, most absurd instance you've had in an Uber Pool that made you realize, okay, I'm never accepting one of these trips again.